What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors goes head-to-head with late-night TV's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Denzel Washington sits down for what was supposed to be a routine interview, only to find himself caught in an ambush that leaves viewers stunned and the entertainment industry reeling. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. It's the moment that exposed the dark side of late night and showed exactly what happens when journalistic integrity collides with Hollywood arrogance. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment below. You won't believe what happens when these two titans clash in what can only be described as the most explosive interview in late-night history. The Late Show studio felt different that night. Even before the cameras rolled, an electric tension crackled through the air the crew couldn't shake. Stephen Colbert paced behind his desk during the break, adjusting his tie with a nervous energy that suggested tonight wouldn't follow the usual script. He'd been briefed on talking points, but something in his demeanor hinted at a separate agenda simmering beneath the surface. Denzel Washington entered with his characteristic dignity, nodding to crew members as he took the guest chair. The two-time Academy Award winner had done countless interviews over his decades-long career, and he approached this one with the same professional composure that made him one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. But as he settled into the burgundy leather chair across from Colbert's desk, there was no way to anticipate the trap about to be sprung. The show opened with Colbert's typical monologue, political commentary, and sharp observations about the day's events. The audience laughed on cue, but the jokes were more pointed than usual, the delivery edged with something brewing just beneath the surface. When the commercial ended and the camera swung to the interview segment, Colbert's smile looked forced as he introduced his guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Denzel Washington," he announced with practiced enthusiasm. But those who knew him could hear the subtle shift in tone, the weight behind a simple introduction. Denzel walked out to thunderous applause, waving warmly. He shook Colbert's hand, settled in, and prepared for what he assumed would be a straightforward conversation about new films and light banter about his illustrious career. The first few minutes went exactly as expected: softball questions about upcoming projects and how he selects roles. "You've been in this business for over 4 decades, Colbert began, leaning forward with apparent interest. "What keeps driving you to take on challenging roles?" Denzel spoke thoughtfully about storytelling and about portraying complex characters with depth and authenticizing measured answers, delivered with the gravitas that made him one of his generation's most respected actors. The audience hung on every word. Then something shifted. Colbert's next question carried a different tone, one that sliced through the friendly atmosphere like a blade through silk. "You know, Denzel, you've built quite a reputation as someone who speaks his mind," he said, smile steady but eyes sharpening, "especially when it comes to certain political and social issues. Some might say you've been quite vocal about your traditional values." Denzel's posture changed subtly but unmistakably. His shoulders squared. His eyes narrowed just enough to signal he recognized the turn. Years in Hollywood had taught him to sense when an interview was veering into uncomfortable territory, and every instinct snapped to high alert. "I believe in speaking truthfully," Denzel replied carefully, voice steady despite the provocation. "I've always tried to be authentic in my public statements, just as I am in my performances." "Authentic," Colbert repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's interesting, because some of your recent comments about faith, family values, and traditional morality have raised eyebrows in certain circles. Would you say those views align with what most people in Hollywood believe today?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and the studio audience seemed to sense the shift in energy. What began as a celebration of Denzel's career was starting to feel like an interrogation, and the veteran actor's expression hardened almost imperceptibly as he processed the re-implication behind Colbert's words. "I don't speak for Hollywood," Denzel replied, his voice gaining a slight edge. "I speak for myself and my convictions. I've been blessed with a platform, and I use it to share what I believe is true and meaningful." Colbert leaned back, his practiced TV smile unbroken, but there was something predatory in his gaze now. Of course. But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with that? Platform especially, when your views might be seen as exclusionary to certain communities." The word exclusionary hit the air like an accusation, and Denzel's jaw tightened. This was no longer an interview about his craft or career. It had become something else entirely. The audience, initially excited to see a favorite actor, now felt they were watching a public trial rather than a late-night segment. "I've never excluded anyone," Denzel said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of someone long careful with words in public forums. "My faith teaches love and acceptance. If people choose to interpret that differently, that's their prerogative, but I won't apologize for believing in something greater than myself. But surely you can see how some of your statements might be interpreted as judgment," Colbert pressed, his tone conversational even as his questions grew sharper. "When you talk about traditional family values, when you emphasize the importance of father figures and traditional marriage structures, doesn't that implicitly suggest other family structures are somehow lesser?" The trap had been sprung, and Denzel could see it clearly now. This wasn't about his movies, his craft, or even his charitable work. It was an ambush designed to force him into a corner where any answer could be twisted into controversy. His hands, which had rested casually on the chair arms, now gripped them slightly tighter as he prepared to navigate the minefield. "What I've said is that children benefit from strong role models and stable family structures," Denzel replied, steady but with a warning undertone. "I've never suggested love comes in only one form, but I won't be shamed for believing fathers have an important role in their children's lives." The audience had grown noticeably quieter, sensing the mounting tension. What started as entertainment was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, and the room's energy reflected the shift. Colbert, however, seemed energized by the conflict, pressing forward with the determination of someone who had spotted blood in the water. But this was only the beginning, and neither man knew how much further the confrontation would escalate. The commercial break that followed felt like a brief ceasefire on a newly formed battlefield. Colbert's producers huddled around him with urgent whispers, while Denzel sat composed, his eyes reflecting the steel of someone pushed too far. Makeup artists rushed to touch up both men, but the tension was so thick that even the crew moved with nervous efficiency, sensing something unprecedented was about to unfold. When the cameras rolled again, Colbert's demeanor was even more calculated. Gone was any pretense of friendly banter or respectful discourse. His smile had a razor-sharp edge, and his posture suggested a predator who had cornered his prey. "Welcome back," Colbert said to the camera, his voice carrying a false brightness that fooled no one. "We're here with Denzel Washington, and we've been having quite an illuminating conversation about values and responsibility in Hollywood." The way he emphasized illuminating made it sound like an accusation, and Denzel's eyes flashed a warning any seasoned interviewer should have recognized. But Colbert seemed intoxicated by the conflict, driven to push the confrontation past the point of no return. "Before the break, we were discussing your views on family structures," Colbert continued, adopting the cadence of a prosecutor. "What really interests our audience is how someone with your influence reconciles those traditional views with the reality of modern America. Don't you think your platform comes with a responsibility to evolve with the times?" The question was loaded, and Denzel's response came with a controlled fury that sent ripples through the studio. "My responsibility is to be honest about what I believe, not to conform to whatever the current social pressure demands," he said. His voice carried the weight of decades spent navigating Hollywood's political landmines. "I've seen trends come and go," Denzel said, But truth doesn't change with the times. Truth, Colbert repeated, leaning forward with theatrical interest. That's a bold claim. Whose truth are we talking about? Because when you talk about traditional marriage, when you emphasize the importance of fathers in ways that seem to diminish other family structures, aren't you really just imposing your personal beliefs on others? The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet, and Denzel's composure began to crack. When he spoke, his voice carried a dangerous edge few had ever heard from the normally diplomatic actor. "Let me be very clear," Denzel said, his words measured but charged with restrained fury. "I have never, ever diminished anyone's family structure. What I've done is speak about the importance of fathers being present in their children's lives because I've seen firsthand what happens when they're not. If you want to twist that into some kind of political statement, that's your choice. But don't put words in my mouth." The studio fell silent. Even the hum of the cameras seemed loud. The audience, who'd come expecting laughs and light banter, now watched something that felt less like an interview and more like a public execution. Colbert's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully provoked his target, and he pressed forward with precision. "But surely you can see how your emphasis on traditional structures might be perceived as judgment," Colbert continued, his tone mockingly reasonable. "When you talk about the importance of marriage between a man and a woman, when you invoke biblical values in public, aren't you essentially saying that people who don't share those values are living incorrectly?" This was the moment when the interview turned from uncomfortable to explosive. Denzel's hands gripped the chair arms until his knuckles turned white. When he spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who'd reached his limit. "You want to know what I think is incorrect?" Denzel said, his voice rising for the first time. "I think it's incorrect to invite me on your show under the pretense of promoting my work, then ambush me with loaded questions meant to make me look like a bigot. I think it's incorrect for a host to twist my words and misrepresent my beliefs to fit whatever narrative they're trying to sell." The attack was direct and devastating. For the first time, Colbert seemed momentarily thrown off balance. But his recovery was swift and his counterattack even sharper. "I'm simply asking you to clarify your public statements," Colbert said, adopting a tone of wounded innocence that was clearly meant to provoke. "If you feel ambushed by being asked to explain your own words, perhaps that says more about the words themselves than about my questions." The implication was clear. If Denzel couldn't defend his statements, maybe they were indefensible. It was a classic media tactic, and Denzel recognized it immediately. His reply came with the force of someone who'd spent a lifetime facing such traps. "Don't you dare try to gaslight me," Denzel said, his voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous tone that was far more intimidating than shouting. "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I've seen every trick in the book. What you're doing right now isn't journalism, it's character assassination disguised as an interview." The accusation hit Colbert like a blow. His mask of composure began to slip. His smile grew forced, his movements agitated. When he spoke again, his voice carried genuine anger. "Character assassination." Colbert shot back, his tone rising to match Denzel's. "I'm asking legitimate questions about public statements you've made. If you can't handle being questioned about your beliefs, maybe you shouldn't express them so publicly. And if you can't handle conducting an interview without turning it into a hit job, maybe you shouldn't be hosting a talk show," Denzel fired back, his composure gone. "You invited me here to talk about my work, my craft, my contribution to cinema. Instead, you've spent the entire time trying to trap me into saying something you can twist to destroy my reputation." The gloves were off. Both men were now engaged in a verbal battle that had gone far beyond the limits of normal television discourse. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud, boo, or simply leave. This was uncharted territory for late-night TV. and everyone in the studio sensed they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed for years. But the clash was far from finished, and what followed would push both men past any hope of reconciliation. Colbert's face flushed with anger that makeup couldn't hide. The careful facade of the thoughtful host had collapsed, replaced by something raw and vindictive that shocked even his own crew. His next words cut through the room like a blade. "Let's talk about hypocrisy, shall we?" he said, voice dripping malice. "You lecture America about traditional values and family structures, yet ignore the parts of your own industry that don't fit that narrative. How many of your colleagues live in ways that contradict everything you claim to stand for, and still you work with them, profit with them, and keep this moral high ground?" The attack turned personal meant not just to challenge Denzel's beliefs, but to label him a fraud. It crossed every line of professional courtesy. Denzel's response was immediate and explosive. "You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," he said, voice shaking with barely contained rage. "I don't judge my colleagues. I don't tell anyone how to live. And I certainly don't use my platform to tear people down the way you're doing right now. I speak my truth when asked, and I treat everyone I work with respect and dignity." Respect and dignity. Colbert scoffed, his professional mask gone. "Is that what you call making statements that alienate entire communities? Using your influence to promote views many find harmful and outdated?" "What I find harmful," Denzel shot back, rising slightly, "is a host who ambushes a guest and then acts like a moral authority. You want to talk about using influence harmfully? Look in the mirror. You've turned what should have been a conversation about art and creativity into a public lynching." The word lynching hit like thunder. It was loaded historically and emotionally, and its use sent shockwaves through the studio. Colbert's eyes widened with genuine outrage, and his reply matched Denzel's intensity. "Don't you dare," Colbert said, pointing across the desk. "Don't you dare use that word to describe being held accountable for your public statements. You came here as a public figure. Public figures get questioned. If you can't handle that, maybe stay out of the public eye." Questioning. Denzel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "This isn't questioning. It's character assassination dressed up as journalism. You didn't invite me for a conversation, you invited me to destroy me on national television. Congratulations, you've shown your true colors. And they're uglier than I imagined." The audience sank deeper into silence. What they were seeing had moved far beyond normal discourse. Many didn't know how to react. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others watched, riveted. All knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Colbert's next blow was the harshest yet, delivered with surgical precision. "You know what this is really about?" he said, leaning in with predatory focus. "An aging actor desperate to stay relevant in a world that's passed him by. You can't adapt, so you wrap yourself in traditional values and pose as a moral beacon, but really, you're just afraid your outdated worldview is irrelevant." The line was so personal, it seemed to drain the room of air. For a moment, even Denzel looked stunned by its cruelty. When he answered, his voice was quiet but devastating. "You want to know what's irrelevant?" he said with steady conviction. "A host who thinks tearing down guests makes him important. A man who confuses cruelty with cleverness and calls ambushes journalism. You're not exposing me. You're exposing yourself, and it's not pretty." Colbert's face shifted from red to pale, his hands visibly shaking as Denzel's words hit home. But pride wouldn't let him retreat. His final strike came with the desperation of someone who knew he was losing. "At least I'm honest about who I am," he said, voice cracking. "I don't hide behind false piety and outdated moral posturing while secretly judging everyone who doesn't fit my narrow worldview." That was the final straw. Denzel stood abruptly, his chair rolling back. When he spoke, it was with the authority of someone at his absolute limit. False piety. Narrow worldview, he said, voice rising to fill the studio. Let me tell you about narrow worldviews, thinking anyone who disagrees with your politics deserves public humiliation. Using your platform to attack guests instead of celebrating their achievements. Believing cruelty makes you clever. He removed his microphone with sharp, decisive movements, signaling the end. I've been in this business over 40 years, he continued, voice heavy with experience. I've worked with people of every background, belief, and lifestyle, treated them all with respect, because that's what decent human beings do. I will not sit here and be disrespected by someone who thinks hosting a talk show gives him the right to attack people's character and beliefs. The mic hit the desk with a sharp thud that echoed in the stunned quiet. Colbert sat frozen, his face a mix of shock and, perhaps, shame, though it was too late for regret. This interview is over, Denzel said, final and unmoving. I came in good faith to talk about my work and my craft. Instead, I faced a host more interested in destruction than dialogue. America deserves better than this kind of television, and I deserve better than what I've received tonight. He turned to the audience, his commanding presence filling the room. To everyone watching, when someone invites you to their table, you expect basic courtesy. What you saw tonight is what happens when courtesy is abandoned for ambush journalism and character assassination. With that, Denzel Washington walked off The Late Show, set leaving behind a host with shattered credibility and an audience that had witnessed the collapse of what late night was supposed to represent. The cameras kept rolling, catching Colbert's stunned expression and the suffocating silence that followed, as Denzel's footsteps echoed backstage. It was clear something fundamental had broken, not just between two men, but in the fabric of public discourse itself. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate far beyond that studio marking. The moment when respectful disagreement gave way to something uglier and more destructive.